You can feel the heat of the soles of your feet blistering under the bastinado. 100 strokes. The counter has reached 73, and each impact sends lightning through your bones, your vision blurring with each crack of wood against flesh. But you know what comes after the 100th stroke. You have heard the stories whispered in the workers' quarters, seen the stakes planted outside the necropolis as warnings. They will not kill you with the beating. The beating is only the beginning. What comes next, a wooden stake, sharpened to a point, the slow vertical insertion that will take hours to complete. The days of exposure while your body refuses to die, that is the punishment that ancient Egypt reserved for those who dared violate the sacred tombs of the pharaohs. And right now, watching this, you're probably thinking you understand ancient Egyptian punishment. You've seen the Hollywood movies, the mummy curses, the dramatics. But what I'm about to show you is not fiction. It's archaeology. It's papyrus records. It's the judicial documentation that survived 32 centuries to tell us exactly what happened to people who committed certain crimes in ancient Egypt. Before we go deeper into the darkness of the Nile Valley's justice system, if you're fascinated by the parts of ancient history that don't make it into the textbooks, hit subscribe right now. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, whether you're in Cairo or California, Melbourne or Manchester. It absolutely amazes me that we have this global community of people hungry to understand what really happened in the ancient world. Not the sanitized version, but the documented truth. The year is 1110 BCE, the reign of Ramesses IX, a pharaoh struggling to maintain order and a kingdom fraying at its edges. The priests have discovered something that threatens the entire cosmology of Egyptian civilization. The royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the eternal resting places of gods made flesh, have been systematically robbed. Gold stripped from mummy wrappings, sacred amulets pried from royal throats, jewelry that was meant to accompany pharaohs into the afterlife sold in the markets of Thebes for fractions of its value. The Abbot Papyrus, now housed in the British Museum, preserves the investigation that followed. 16 tombs inspected, 8 found violated. The judicial records name names, describe methods, detail confessions extracted through beating and threat. A coppersmith named Amenpanufer confessed to raiding the tomb of King Sobkumsaf II with 7 accomplices. They had tunneled through 30 feet of rock, broken through the sealed entrance, stripped the king and queen of their golden ornaments, burned the wooden coffins for light, and divided 18 pounds of gold and silver between them. The legal proceedings that followed were not merely about theft. In the Egyptian worldview, these men had committed an offense against Mat, the cosmic principle of order and justice, and their punishment needed to restore balance to a universe they had unbalanced. The papyrus records are specific about what happened next. The convicted tomb robbers were subjected to 2 stages of punishment. First, the beating. The bastinado was the standard method of corporal punishment throughout ancient Egypt, but for capital crimes it became an instrument of something beyond mere pain. 100 strokes applied to the soles of the feet with heavy wooden rods. The purpose was not to kill. Trained beaters knew exactly how much force to apply to destroy tissue without rupturing major arteries, but to ensure that every step the convicted man took for the rest of his drastically shortened life would be agony. Medical analysis of ancient Egyptian remains that show evidence of bastinado damage reveals fractures, torn ligaments and bone spurs that would have made walking excruciating. But the convicted men still had to walk, because after the 100th stroke they were taken to the impalement stakes. Impalement in ancient Egypt was not the quick, spearing through the chest depicted in movies. The archaeological and textual evidence points to a method far more calculated, far more prolonged. The UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology notes that during the Ramesside era, the period of the tomb robbery trials, impalement became the preferred form of execution for crimes against the state and sacred institutions. The stake was vertical, sharpened, treated with oil to reduce friction. The condemned man was positioned above it, and then gravity and the executioner's measured pressure did their work. The stake entered through the rectum, passed through the abdominal cavity, and if the executioner was skilled, and evidence suggests Egyptian executioners were very skilled, it missed the major organs just enough that the victim remained conscious. The process could take hours. The placement on the stake another 2 to 3 hours, and then the victim was left there, impaled, but not immediately dead, as a warning to anyone who might consider similar crimes. The biological reality of this punishment is difficult to contemplate, but the evidence compels us to understand it. The human body, when impaled vertically through the torso, can remain alive for days if major blood vessels are avoided. Ancient Egyptian executioners understood anatomy with the precision of embalmers because many of them were embalmers. They knew exactly how to maximize suffering while prolonging life. They knew which pathways through the body would result in death within hours and which would result in death within days. And the judicial records suggest they chose the latter. The victims of impalement were displayed outside the necropolis, visible from the roads that workers and pilgrims used to access the Valley of the Kings. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens when you violate the sacred. This is what happens when you steal from the gods. They could not look away. Passing caravans forced to witness the impaled men in various stages of death absorbed the lesson that the state intended. Impalement was not a private execution. It was public theater, a performance of state power that required an audience to fulfill its purpose. The tomb robber Amenpanofur, whose confession is preserved in the Meyer Papyrus, described the moment of his arrest with language that reveals his understanding of what awaited him. "The fear of death came upon me," the scribe recorded his words. Not just death, but the manner of death. Everyone in Thebes knew what happened to tomb robbers who were caught. The evidence was rotting on stakes outside the city walls. Amenpanofur and his accomplices had stolen from the tomb of Sob-Kemsef sometime around 1110 BCE. The investigation that caught them was extensive, involving testimony from dozens of witnesses, physical evidence traced through the markets of Thebes, and ultimately confessions extracted through judicial torture. The legal process that condemned them was, by ancient standards, remarkably bureaucratic. The Abbot Papyrus describes a court system with judges, prosecutors, defendants, and detailed record-keeping. But the outcome was never in doubt. Once the evidence was sufficient, once the confessions were obtained, the sentence for tomb robbery was fixed by centuries of precedent. First the beating, then the impalement. The tomb robbery papyri reveals something else disturbing about these punishments. The crimes were often committed by the very workers employed to build and maintain the tombs. Stone cutters who knew the layout of the burial chambers, necropolis guards who understood the patrol schedules, low-level priests who had access to the sacred precincts. These were not outside criminals, but insiders, people who had intimate knowledge of the tombs they violated. And this made their punishment, in the Egyptian worldview, even more necessary. They had betrayed trust. They had violated their oaths to the gods. They had corrupted the institutions that maintained cosmic order. The Papyrus Leopold II, part of the same cache of tomb robbery documents, describes the interrogation methods used to extract confessions: beating with sticks until blood ran, twisting of limbs, sleep deprivation, threats of mutilation. And these were just the interrogation methods, the preliminary suffering before the formal punishment began. The suspects were questioned in the great court at Thebes, a judicial venue that combined the functions of criminal court and religious tribunal. The judges were not merely legal officials, but priests, men responsible for maintaining Mat through the proper application of justice. The confession of the coppersmith Amenhotep IV is preserved in remarkable detail. He described how his group had tunneled through rock for an entire night, how they had broken through the sealed entrance of Sobu-Pansaf's tomb, how they had found the king and queen in their nested coffins, how they had stripped the gold from the mummies, burned the wooden coffins to provide light, and divided the precious metals. He estimated they had stolen the equivalent of 18 pounds of gold and silver, an enormous sum, but a fraction of what the tomb originally contained. His testimony was recorded by a scribe named Nesimon, whose careful hand preserved these events for posterity. The papyrus notes that Amenhotep's feet were beaten during the interrogation, and that after 100 strokes he confessed fully. Whether his confession would have come without the beating is a question the ancient documents don't address. Egyptian legal procedure simply assumed that truth emerged through physical compulsion. Once guilt was established, the punishment was carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. The convicted men were taken from the court to the execution grounds. The Abbott Papyrus doesn't describe the execution process itself. Such details were apparently too obvious to require documentation, but comparative evidence from other ancient Near Eastern cultures, combined with Egyptian reliefs showing impalement, allows us to reconstruct the method with grim accuracy. The convicted man would be stripped. His hands would be bound behind his back to prevent him from attempting to grasp the stake or pull himself off it. He would be positioned over the vertical stake, and 2 executioners would lower him onto it, controlling the rate of penetration. The stake would enter through the perineum or rectum and be guided upward through the torso. If done with sufficient skill, it would emerge through the left shoulder or neck, avoiding the heart and lungs long enough to ensure the victim remained conscious for hours. The impaled man would then be left on display. Guards would be posted to prevent family members from attempting to remove the body. The exposure would continue for days, possibly weeks, until decomposition was advanced enough that removal became necessary for public health reasons. They could not look away. Children walking to school past the execution grounds, merchants traveling to market, workers commuting to the necropolis. Everyone who passed absorbed the visual lesson that the state was providing. This is the cost of violating the sacred. This is the consequence of disturbing the eternal rest of the pharaohs. But impalement was not the only horrific punishment that ancient Egyptian justice employed. For crimes that were serious but fell short of tomb robbery, mutilation was the preferred method. The Turin Judicial Papyrus, dating to around 1155 BCE, documents a conspiracy to assassinate Rameses III. The plot involved members of the royal household, including one of the king's wives. The conspirators were caught, tried, and sentenced to various punishments based on their level of involvement. Some were allowed to commit suicide, considered a merciful option because it preserved the possibility of proper burial and afterlife. Others were executed by burning. But the mid-level conspirators, those who had known about the plot but not actively participated, received a sentence that the papyrus describes with clinical precision: "May my nose and ears be cut off." This was not metaphorical language. It was a literal description of the punishment. Archaeological evidence confirms that mutilation was practiced exactly as described. The procedure was carried out by specialists, likely the same individuals who performed mummification, as they possessed the necessary anatomical knowledge and cutting tools. The convicted person would be restrained. A sharp bronze blade would be used to sever the cartilage of the nose, removing it completely down to the nasal bone. The ears would be cut off at their base. No anesthetic was used. No medical care was provided afterward. The mutilated person was released back into society, bearing permanent, visible markers of their criminality. The social function of this punishment was different from impalement. Impalement killed and warned. Mutilation marked and shamed. A person with a severed nose could not participate in normal social life. They could not marry. They could not hold positions of trust. They were visually marked as criminals for the rest of their lives, walking reminders of what happened to those who violated the law. The Cambridge University study, "May My Nose and Ears Be Cut Off," by A. Lakshanov examines this punishment in detail, noting that it served both practical and super-practical functions. Practically, it prevented the convicted person from reoffending by marking them so obviously that they couldn't operate in positions requiring trust. Super-practically, it demonstrated the state's power to alter the human body, to remake a person's physical form as punishment for their crimes. The study notes that mutilation was most commonly applied to thieves, corrupt officials, and those who had committed perjury in court. The severity of the mutilation varied with the severity of the crime. Minor theft might result in the loss of a hand, making future theft more difficult. Major theft or corruption might result in the loss of nose and ears, making any future employment in positions of trust impossible. Treason or conspiracy could result in more extensive mutilation, including castration or the removal of the tongue. The case of the royal assassination plot provides specific details. The Turin Judicial Papyrus names 42 defendants, ranging from high officials to servants. The chief conspirators were burned alive, a punishment reserved for the most serious crimes against the pharaoh. The secondary conspirators were given the option of suicide, and the tertiary conspirators, those who had known about the plot but not actively participated, received a mutilation sentence. The papyrus records their names and their punishments with the detached precision of bureaucratic record-keeping. The overseer of the treasury, Ibek Common, he was brought in because he had been in collusion with the women who had made the conspiracy. He was placed before the great officials of the court. They examined his crimes. They found him guilty. They caused his punishment to overtake him by cutting off his nose and ears. Similar entries follow from multiple other defendants. The language is formulaic, suggesting this was a routine judicial procedure, not an exceptional punishment devised for this particular crime. And this reveals something crucial about ancient Egyptian justice. These weren't spontaneous acts of cruelty. They were systematized, bureaucratized, documented procedures that the state had been refining for centuries. The people who carried out these punishments were not sadists acting on impulse. They were officials following established protocols, applying punishments that were codified in legal tradition and religious obligation. The evidence from multiple papyri and archaeological sites confirms that Egyptian law recognized gradations of punishment, calibrated to the severity of the crime and the status of the offender. Minor offenses might result in beating or fines. Moderate offenses might result in forced labor or mutilation. Major offenses might result in execution by various methods: beheading for some crimes, burning for others, impalement for still others. The most serious offenses, those that threatened the cosmic order itself, resulted in punishments that combined multiple forms of suffering. Tomb robbery, for instance, might involve beating, mutilation, and then impalement. The victim would be beaten to ensure every step was agony. Their nose and ears might be cut off to mark them as criminals even before the final punishment. And then they would be impaled, experiencing days of suffering before death finally came. The archaeological evidence for ancient Egyptian punishment comes from reliefs, texts, and bones. Ramesside relief sculptures depict impalement clearly, but without sensationalism. Vertical stakes, human figures fixed upon them, guards watching, bystanders kept at distance. These scenes adorned temples and administrative buildings, serving as permanent warnings about law and power. Skeletal remains from workers' cemeteries confirm the images. Healed fractures in foot bones show repeated bastinado blows from flat wooden rods. Other skeletons display deliberate mutilation, noses cleanly cut, vertebrae marked by decapitation, pelvic damage consistent with impalement. These punishments were not metaphors. They were real, systematic procedures. What made them especially disturbing was their religious logic. Egyptians believed in Mat, the cosmic balance of truth and order. Crime damaged this balance, threatening civilization itself. Punishment was therefore ritual repair, not mere deterrence. When a tomb robber was impaled, his suffering was believed to counteract cosmic disorder. Pain, duration, and public display mattered. A quick death would not restore balance. Suffering had to be visible, prolonged, and sufficient. Legal texts reveal proportionality within this worldview. Minor theft might earn beating and fines. Theft from temples brought mutilation. Robbing royal tombs demanded beating, mutilation, and impalement, reflecting increasing cosmic harm. The Abbot Papyrus records a stonecutter, Hapi, beaten during interrogation. He survived and maintained innocence. Officials released him, believing the gods would not spare a liar. Survival itself became divine judgment. By the late New Kingdom, corruption strained the system. Guards, priests, and officials joined tomb robbers. Punishments grew harsher and more public, especially under Ramesses X, and X-impalement became common. Stakes stood outside Thebes bearing decomposing bodies. Yet robbery continued, gold outweighed fear, and officials were often complicit. Justice also followed status. Craftsmen and guards were punished brutally. High officials were rarely recorded suffering the same fate. In the Turin judicial papyrus, elite conspirators against Ramesses III were allowed suicide, preserving burial rites, while lower participants were mutilated or burned. Mat demanded order, including social hierarchy. Still, When impalement was imposed, the method did not vary. The stake, the exposure, and the suffering were constant. Ancient Egypt's brilliance and cruelty were inseparable. Its monuments rose alongside a system of calculated, religiously justified torture, preserved in papyri and bone, impossible to ignore. This legacy endures as evidence of power maintained through fear, belief, ritualized pain, and control.